So I'm just thinking about a little bit about free will, but I'm also thinking about knowledge and understanding and grokking and masturbation, and because these things have come up in a series of videos recently, and I'm trying to and they kind of link together in my head a little bit. Where should I start with all this then? First, let me just start with free will. Actually, this might be a separate video. I'll start with it anyway. But it seems to me that a lot of this stuff about free will relies on the idea of an agent. People have been talking about agency, so it relies on the idea of some kind of Cartesian subject, an I, a person who makes these decisions somehow, an unmoved mover at the heart of your being, who makes these decisions. That's even when we don't configure it like that. Even when we say we're not configuring it like that, I think a lot of the time we are, because it's completely impenetrated in our language, isn't it? With all the words like choice, decide, choose, intend, all those kind of words that we use, all have a subject to them. There's an I that does the choosing, and the I is just lying there like the elephant in your head or something. But so I think that all this free will stuff is absolutely bound up with the idea of an I and a subject that has agency and intentionality in the world, and can make those choices. But we know this I doesn't exist. I mean, we know what it exists, but it exists as a phenomenon. It doesn't exist as a thing. I think this is Bureau 314. You were talking about this, but it's a product of the system that is producing everything else. The fact that it's self-reflexive and seems to be and uses this language of choice doesn't mean that it understands. It just means that it's capable of using this kind of language and has these kinds of experiences. But this I itself is kind of. I think we reinforce our own belief in it just by using the language of it. I kind of wish we could use a language that didn't use I. I mean, I have experimented with this in the past, a long time ago though. But I kind of wish we could find a way of speaking that just left all those words out. Just to see what it was like, just to see what consciousness felt like if it wasn't always expressing itself through this I word, or through me, or through choosing and all these kind of words. It would make a huge difference, I think. I really do, because it's almost like it's not exactly a figment of speech. It's a figment of thought, but that thought and speech are kind of self-reinforcing, aren't they? They bind together quite a lot. So I think there's something in there about that, and I think I may be wrong here, but I do think we're in the midst of a kind of change, a change that probably started with Descartes, but more specifically a 20th century philosophy. But I think we're on our way out of that now, and I think I can imagine in 200 years, probably less, people will look back on this era in the way that we look back on like the 14th, 15th, 16th century. You know what I mean? Because I think in those times, probably, and still today for some people, weirdly, in those times certainly, it was almost inconceivable to imagine a world without God. It just didn't make sense. It was like the world had a hole in it, or understanding had a hole in it, which was the perfect shape for this God idea to fit into. So the world literally did not make sense without God. So the brain, or the actions of other parts of the world, or something like that, creates this formation, like the eye in the centre of a hurricane. It creates this formation, this phenomena. It's not an illusion, but this phenomena called God. We can call it a delusion if you like. It doesn't really matter what we call it. But either way, in that period of time, the world only made sense if it had God in it. So sure enough, understanding produces this phenomena called God. But now our understanding's moved on, hasn't it? And things have changed. The storm has moved to a different location, and now it's perfectly possible to make sense of the world without God. I know for some people it isn't, and I think it's striking that those people tend to have this failure of imagination, have that same failure to imagine a world in which God doesn't exist, and can't believe that atheists exist. That kind of failure of imagination, I think, is absolutely to do with the fact that the world, because the world doesn't make sense without this God, it's created as a real phenomena, not a real thing, but a real phenomena, to make sense of the world. And that's where I'm going with that, is that I think in the future we'll look back on this era, the egotistical era of having an I, in the way that we do now. This I that looks around the world, Cartesian subject, makes everything happen, makes choices, decides which flavour of ice cream to buy, all those kinds of things. We'll look back on this I in the same way that we now look back on and look at people who believe in God as being slightly weird, but slightly mystifying. How could these people, we say now, how could these people believe in God? It's such an unnecessary addition to an explainable world. I think in a couple of 100 years' time, people will be looking back on this era in the same way. How could people believe in these Cartesian subjects? How could people believe they have this thing called agency? It's so mystifying. That's kind of what I imagine what people will think about. And there'll probably be, there'll still be a few egoists about. I guess they'll be called something like egoists, people who believe in the I, the ego. There'll still be a few of those about. And then, of course, there'll be, I don't know what you call the opposite of that. Like the opposite of theist is atheist, isn't it? Or non-believers. Egoist doesn't really work. Non-egoists, unegoists, anti-egoists. There'll be, they'll be the majority at that point, or a significant minority at the very least. People who just recognise this sensation for what it is, or maybe they won't even sense it anymore. If language and thought has moved on, then they won't even get the sense of an I being there, in the same way that we atheists don't really get a sense of a God being there. I have no doubt that people who believe in God do sense the presence of God. I imagine that's probably the case. That's what they say, and I have no reason to disbelieve them. And I imagine that they sense it with the same strength and conviction and belief that I am sensing, some of the time at least, the presence of an ego in here, a person that is responsible for the words coming out of my mouth right now. But that'll fade, I think, with time. I think with time that'll fade. But first off, to start recognising it, as people are already doing. Even just here on YouTube, people are talking about this, and on U-doubled, I should say, and on Vimeo and the rest of the online environments. People are already talking about this and kind of rehearsing that particular revolution out of that whirlwind into a decentralised kind of understanding of what it is to be alive and awake, really. It doesn't have all those choices and intentions and agency and Cartesian subjects and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. That'd be quite interesting. What was I going to talk about? Oh yeah, I was going to talk about masturbation and grokking. Yeah. I guess this is coming out of a couple of videos I've watched recently. Partly a little conversation I've had with Mystic and other people, Gary, one or two other people, Rosebush, Temple of Nature. This is all on U-doubled. It was to do with free will, but I was trying to develop a sense of this. Where is agency? It doesn't reside in your body. If there's agency at all, it's distributed, and then you can't really call it agency, because agency just becomes a kind of product of the language that you're using to describe it. It's just a whirlwind. And Mystic got a bit pissed off with me about that and said it was wank, and somebody else said it was woo-woo. Gary, you said it was woo-woo. It's not woo-woo, it's just physics, by the way. I firmly believe that woo-woo, that's kind of, what's the other word, phantasmagorical stuff, is really it's subjectivity. Feeling like it's an I, that's woo-woo. Believing that I exist as an I, as a Cartesian subject, somehow separate from the world. That's the woo-woo. Everything else, the hard science, the physics, everything else says that no, that's a phenomenal experience produced by the system. So no, it's not woo-woo at all. It might be slightly purple prose in its description, but it's not woo-woo. Woo-woo is saying I. As soon as you say I, you're deploying woo-woo theistic thinking, egoistic theistic thinking. What's that going to do with masturbation? Oh yeah, well I suppose because in that same video, Nick, Modern Mystic, was talking about understanding. And there's something really interesting there about understanding. Because understanding is different to knowing, isn't it? Knowing something is different to understanding it. Which is why I think this word grok was used. This is a word that comes out of Strange in a Strange Land, Robert Heinlein story. But Modern Mystic used it. And it means to, not just to know something, but to kind of embody it, to know it in a way and yet so you kind of really, really know it. You understand it, that's the common phrase, isn't it? You understand it. You take it on in a way that becomes part of the way you think, not just what you think about, it becomes part of the way you think. grokking it or understanding it. But there's something about that understanding which is both good and bad, isn't there? You know, because understanding is good, and I'm kind of in the business of understanding, because I'm in education, and certainly in the field of education that I'm in, knowledge isn't enough. You have to develop understanding in the students. They have to do things, you have to perform the knowledge that you give them. So it's not just about being able to trot out facts, they have to be able to manifest those ideas in embodied practice. So understanding is really important there. And sometimes it's when you're doing the kind of thing that I'm talking about here, that I do in my day job, that's absolutely right. But there's some things which are beyond understanding, I think. Because our understanding is coterminous, or is limited by or constrained by the nature of our embodiment, isn't it? You know, we can only understand what our brains are capable of understanding, and our brains are only really capable of understanding the things that our bodies are designed by history and by evolution to function in relation to. That's, you know, we have our brains are there to mobilize our body in the world. So our understanding is the understanding of brains that are designed to do that job. You know, we can do a little bit more. We can use maths and we can use metaphors and we can extend our understanding out a wee bit, but we can't extend it indefinitely. And some things are beyond literal embodiment. We can get there and we can touch them, we can know things, but we can't take them into our body in the way that the real grokking does. You know, you can't, like a two-dimensional being could never really grok what it's like to be in a three-dimensional world. You know, like in that Flatland, the Abbott story, great story, but two-dimensional beings, they could never grok what it's like to be in the three-dimensional world. You could tell them and they could probably do the maths, but they wouldn't know what it's like, you know, to do this three-dimensional thing. So what's that got to do with it? Yeah, so when we try to understand something, so when we do understand something, that feeling of understanding, and it is accompanied by a feeling, the feeling of knowledge entering the body and becoming part of the body, that feeling is sometimes misplaced, I think. Sometimes when we understand something, we shouldn't be swayed by that. You know, we're being fooled by our own understandings, I think. And if we understand something too early in the process, if we close down our understanding, again, I kind of know this from education, if we understand something too early, then we've closed down an opportunity to develop further knowledge and understand something that's actually richer and more complex than we thought. So being kind of addicted to the feeling understanding is sometimes a problem, and leaving things a little bit open, which is hard because it is so tempting to close things down. Leave things a little bit open and delaying that understanding moment as long as possible is a good thing, quite a lot of the time. Yeah, and that's delaying that grokking, perhaps indefinitely, because there's some things, as I say, are beyond our capacity to grok as three-dimensional beings in an 11-dimensional universe. So we should, in all likelihood, satisfy ourselves that we're probably never going to grok them. I'm with Richard Feynman here. There's some things we should never really accept the fact that we're never really going to grok them. We're never really going to understand quantum theory. We're going to do the math, and that's going to work, and we should be satisfied with that. What's that got to do with masturbation? Oh yeah, I'll tell you what's got to do with masturbation. It's got to do with this phrase which I keep coming across, which is funny, which is this phrase, "I found this hard to masturbate to." It's a phrase in a video. It featured in a video that Cypherson recently subscribed to. He commented on this video, which is just two young women, quite a funny video. They're just reading their comments, and because they're quite young, attractive women, the comments are largely to do with presumably young men leaving comments saying that they're masturbating whilst watching their videos. Lots of faps, and one of the phrases, this phrase, "I find this video easy to masturbate to," which is so interesting. I mean, obviously it means it literally in that, but I've come across it in some of my videos, which is just a joke, obviously, and many other videos. I find this easy to masturbate to, or conversely, I find this hard to masturbate to. But I think, I might be wrong here, but I think that's masturbation being used as a metaphor for grokking. You know what I mean? That kind of culmination, that coming into the body, paradoxically, that coming being both a coming out and a coming into the body of knowledge. You know, that cycle of climactic rising and falling of the knowledge gathering process. You know what I mean? That kind of sensation. And sometimes, if something's hard to understand, or if something's hard to feel desirable for, hard to feel desire for, then it's hard to masturbate to, or it's hard to know. So I think there's parallels being drawn there between something that's hard to understand and something that's hard to masturbate to. Something that's hard to get that feeling of knowing out of, as well as something that's hard to get that feeling of coming out of. It's that, there's a parallel there, I think. Which reminds me of Russell Howard joke. Russell Howard's a stand-up comedian here in the UK. I don't really like him that much actually, but he did this great joke where he was talking about, he told this story of this video he'd seen, but I can't remember what the video was about, but it's this really distasteful video, and it was involving, I don't know, abuse and death and murder and various things, and he kind of ended it, and he'd seen it on YouTube, I guess, and he ended it by saying, yeah, hardest wank I ever had. I just thought it was really funny, because it was that, here is something that's really hard to look at, it's really difficult to look at, hard to understand, hard to embody, hard to take in, and he ends it by doing that little punchline, I find this hard to masturbate to, hardest wank I ever had. Yeah. Anyhow, I don't know whether those things are connected up to free will thing, because free will is something about that. I don't know, that not knowing, isn't it? Or that attempt to know. It's embedded in that. You know what I mean? When you're trying to know something, you know what I mean? There's an I that is trying to know and trying to complete that cycle. That's what it feels like, Even though we know even though there's no idea there. There's no dear I there, is there? The centre of that particular storm of ignorance. Anyhow, that's it really. All by myself today, dying of loneliness.